My name is TK421, and I was standing guard at detention block AA23 when I first understood what it truly meant to serve the Empire. The moment came not in the heat of battle or during some grand ceremony, but in the silence between heartbeats as I watched a prisoner's eyes dim with the knowledge that hope was nothing more than a luxury the Empire could not afford to permit. You want to know what it's like to be a Stormtrooper? You want to understand what it means to wear the white armor and carry the weight of Imperial authority across a galaxy that refuses to accept the necessity of order? Then listen carefully, because the truth is not what the recruitment holovids show you. The truth is not what the rebels scream in their propaganda broadcasts. The truth is something far more complex, far more human, and far more terrible than either side will admit. I was born on Coruscant in the year 12 BBY, though the date matters less than the circumstances. My parents worked in the industrial sectors, processing recycled materials for the endless construction projects that kept the capital world functioning. They were good Imperial citizens, loyal and obedient, who understood that individual comfort was less important than collective security. They taught me to respect authority, to value order over chaos, and to never question the wisdom of those who had dedicated their lives to protecting the Empire from its countless enemies. The recruitment center stood in the shadow of the Imperial Palace, its durasteel walls polished to mirror brightness by cleaning droids that worked through the night. I was 17 standard years old when I first walked through those doors, my head full of dreams about serving the Emperor and bringing peace to a galaxy torn apart by rebellion and civil war. The recruitment sergeant who processed my application was a veteran of the Clone Wars, his face marked by scars that spoke of battles fought in service to the Republic that had become our empire. "What makes you think you have what it takes to be a Stormtrooper?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many young men die for causes they didn't fully understand. "I want to serve the Empire, sir," I replied, using the words that had been drummed into me since childhood. "I want to help bring order to the galaxy." The sergeant studied me for a long moment, his eyes evaluating something that had nothing to do with my physical fitness or my test scores. "Order," he repeated, as if the word tasted bitter in his mouth. "Do you know what order really costs, son? Do you understand what you're volunteering to become?" I thought I did. I was wrong about almost everything. The Imperial Academy on Karita was designed to break down everything you thought you knew about yourself and rebuild you according to specifications developed over decades of military experience. The process began before dawn on your first day and continued until lights out. A relentless schedule of physical training, weapons instruction, tactical studies, and psychological conditioning that left no room for individual reflection or personal doubt. My bunkmate was a young man named Davin Krell from a mining world in the Outer Rim. He had joined the Imperial military after watching his homeworld's government collapse into factional warfare, leaving millions of civilians caught between competing warlords who cared nothing for the suffering they caused. "At least the Empire brings stability," he told me during one of our rare moments of private conversation. "Maybe their methods are harsh, but they're consistent. People know what to expect." The training itself was brutal but not unnecessarily cruel. Our instructors were professionals who understood the difference between discipline and sadism. They pushed us to our physical and mental limits, not because they enjoyed watching us suffer, but because they knew that the enemies we would face would show no mercy to those who were unprepared for the realities of combat. Every exercise, every drill, every moment of instruction was designed to keep us alive long enough to accomplish our missions and serve the greater good of Imperial stability. We learned to strip and reassemble our blasters while blindfolded, to navigate by the stars when our equipment failed, to identify rebel tactics and respond with appropriate countermeasures. But more importantly, we learned to think as part of a unit rather than as individuals. The famous white armor that would eventually become our second skin was introduced gradually, piece by piece, until wearing it felt more natural than our own clothes. The helmet was the final element, cutting off peripheral vision and filtering our voices through electronic modulators that made us sound identical to our comrades. The psychological effect was subtle but deep. When you donned the complete Stormtrooper kit, you stopped being whoever you had been before and became something larger. Something that existed primarily as part of the Imperial war machine. Your individual thoughts and feelings mattered less than your ability to function as a component in a system designed to maintain order across thousands of worlds and billions of citizens. The weeks passed in a blur of exhaustion and conditioning. We marched until our feet bled inside our boots, fired our weapons until our fingers cramped around the triggers, and studied tactical manuals until our eyes burned from strain. Those who couldn't keep pace disappeared quietly from our ranks, transferred to other units, or simply discharged from service with the notation that they lacked the necessary qualifications for Stormtrooper duty. Davin struggled more than most. His world had been primitive by Imperial standards, and he lacked the technological background that many of us took for granted. But he worked harder than anyone else in our training company, staying up late to practice with equipment that still seemed alien to him, asking questions that revealed his determination to succeed despite his disadvantages. "I can't go back," he told me one night after a particularly difficult day of combat training. "My world is gone. The Empire annexed it 6 months after I left for the Academy. Everyone I ever knew is either dead or scattered across the galaxy. This is the only family I have left." His words resonated with many of us who had left home to serve the Empire. The military became more than just a career. It was a new identity that replaced whatever we had been before. The bonds formed during training were stronger than blood relationships, forged in the shared crucible of hardship and mutual dependence that characterized Stormtrooper preparation. The Academy graduation ceremony took place in a vast parade ground surrounded by towering statues of Imperial heroes. Governor Tarkin himself delivered the commencement address, his cold eyes scanning the ranks of newly minted Stormtroopers as he spoke about duty and sacrifice and the heavy burden of maintaining civilization in a galaxy that seemed determined to slide into chaos. "You are no longer citizens," he told us, his voice carrying easily across the assembled formation. "You are instruments of Imperial will. Your lives, your deaths, your every action must serve the greater purpose of galactic stability. Some of you will die in service to this cause. All of you will sacrifice pieces of your humanity to ensure that billions of others can live in peace and security." I thought about those words many times in the years that followed, usually while standing guard in some corridor or checkpoint, watching the endless flow of Imperial personnel going about their daily business. The Empire was not just a government or a military force, but a vast organism composed of countless individual cells, each one performing its assigned function without needing to understand the larger purpose it served. Bureaucrats processed requisitions, technicians maintained equipment, officers made tactical decisions, and Stormtroopers like myself stood ready to enforce compliance with whatever orders came down from above. My first assignment was to the Star Destroyer Devastator under the command of Captain Praji. The ship was a monument to Imperial engineering, its wedge-shaped hull stretching for over a kilometer and containing everything necessary to project Imperial power across multiple star systems. The corridors buzzed with constant activity as thousands of crew members worked to maintain the complex systems that kept the massive vessel operational. Stormtroopers formed the backbone of internal security, manning checkpoints and conducting patrols that ensured no unauthorized personnel could access critical areas of the ship. The Devastator was more than just a warship. It was a floating city that contained everything from detention blocks to medical facilities to recreational areas for off-duty personnel. My squad was assigned to the detention level, a sterile maze of holding cells and interrogation chambers where enemies of the Empire were processed according to carefully established protocols. The work was monotonous but essential, requiring constant vigilance to prevent escapes or rescue attempts while maintaining the security necessary for proper intelligence gathering. Guard duty aboard a Star Destroyer was simultaneously boring and nerve-wracking. Hours would pass with nothing more exciting than checking identification cards and monitoring sensor readings, punctuated by moments of intense activity when the ship went to battle stations or conducted boarding operations against suspected rebel vessels. The routine was carefully designed to maintain readiness while preventing the kind of complacency that could lead to security breaches or equipment failures. The prisoners who passed through our detention blocks came from every corner of the galaxy and represented every level of the rebel organization. Some were hardened fighters who had been captured during combat operations, their eyes burning with hatred for everything the Empire represented. Others were civilians who had been caught providing aid to rebel forces, their faces showing confusion and fear rather than ideological commitment. Still others were suspected rebel sympathizers who had been detained on the basis of intelligence reports or suspicious behavior patterns. Interrogations were conducted by specialized personnel trained in extracting information from uncooperative subjects. As guards, we were not directly involved in these sessions, but we could hear the sounds that emerged from the interrogation chambers and see the condition of prisoners when they were returned to their cells. The experience was deeply unsettling, forcing us to confront the reality of what the Empire was willing to do to maintain security and gather intelligence. "You can't think of them as people," Sergeant Voss told me during one of our conversations about the moral challenges of detention duty. "The moment you start seeing them as individuals with families and dreams and legitimate grievances, you'll lose the ability to do your job effectively. They're enemies of the state, threats to the stability that keeps billions of people safe. Whatever happens to them is necessary for the greater good." But the real education in Imperial service came not from the official training or the formal procedures, but from the conversations you had with other Stormtroopers during the quiet hours between shifts. Men like Sergeant Voss, a 20-year veteran who had served on dozens of worlds and seen more combat than most officers, would share stories that never appeared in official reports or academy textbooks. "The thing you have to understand," he told me one night while we were pulling security duty in the detention block, "is that the Empire isn't just about power or control. It's about preventing something worse from happening. You see the rebel propaganda, all their talk about freedom and democracy and individual rights. But they never mention what happens when central authority breaks down, when every system and every world starts making its own rules." He gestured toward the cell blocks that surrounded us, each one containing prisoners who had been captured during anti-Imperial operations. "Half these people aren't professional rebels or hardened terrorists. They're ordinary citizens who got caught up in movements they didn't fully understand, convinced by charismatic leaders that they could create some kind of perfect society if they just overthrew the existing order. They never stopped to think about what would replace it or whether their new system would actually be better than what they were trying to destroy." The prisoners themselves told a different story when they thought no one was listening. "During my months on the Devastator, I learned to position myself where I could observe the detention blocks without being obvious about it, watching the interactions between prisoners and listening to their conversations when they thought they were alone. What I heard challenged many of the assumptions I had been taught about the nature of the rebellion and the motivations of those who opposed Imperial rule. Farmers whose families had been displaced by Imperial mining operations spoke not of abstract political theories but of children who had starved when their crops were seized to feed Imperial garrison troops. Small business owners crushed by trade regulations that favored larger corporations, with connections to the Imperial bureaucracy, described watching their life's work crumble under the weight of taxes and compliance costs they could not afford. Young people who had joined the rebellion told stories of friends and relatives who had disappeared into Imperial detention centers and never been seen again. Both perspectives contained elements of truth, though neither side was willing to admit the complexity of the situation they found themselves in. The Empire had brought stability and prosperity to many worlds, ending local conflicts and establishing trade networks that benefited billions of people. But that stability came at the cost of individual autonomy and local self-determination, creating resentment among populations who felt they had traded freedom for security without being consulted about the exchange. My understanding of these contradictions deepened during my second assignment, a posting to the garrison on Tatooine where Imperial forces maintained a minimal presence to monitor smuggling activities and watch for rebel infiltration. The desert world was nominally under Imperial control, but the reality was more complicated. Local crime syndicates like the Hutts maintained their own power structures. Imperial authority extended only as far as our patrol routes, and the indigenous population viewed all off-worlders with suspicion regardless of their political affiliation. The contrast between Tatooine and the ordered corridors of the Devastator was stark and educational. Here, the limitations of Imperial power became obvious in ways that were invisible from the bridge of a Star Destroyer. We could control the major spaceports and the primary trade routes, but the vast stretches of desert remained largely ungoverned territories where Imperial law meant little, and survival depended on personal relationships and local knowledge rather than official authority. Mos Eisley was a perfect example of these limitations. The spaceport cantina was officially off-limits to Imperial personnel, but the prohibition was rarely enforced as long as we maintained proper decorum and avoided incidents that might embarrass the garrison command. The establishment served as an informal intelligence gathering post where you could learn more about local conditions in a single evening than weeks of official briefings would provide. Smugglers, mercenaries, and various other characters of questionable legality gathered there to conduct business and share information about conditions throughout the Outer Rim territories. Our duties on Tatooine involved regular patrols through the scattered settlements that dotted the planet's surface, checking identification papers and searching for contraband or evidence of rebel activity. The work was tedious and often dangerous, as the desert environment could kill the unwary, and some of the local inhabitants viewed Imperial stormtroopers as legitimate targets for robbery or worse, but it also provided opportunities to interact with civilian populations in ways that were impossible aboard a military vessel. The moisture farmers who scraped out a living in the wastes were neither enthusiastic supporters nor active opponents of the Empire. They wanted to be left alone to pursue their difficult lives without interference from any external authority, whether Imperial, criminal, or rebel. When pressed, most would admit that Imperial rule was preferable to the chaos that had characterized the region during the final years of the Republic, but their cooperation was pragmatic rather than ideological. "We don't care who runs the galaxy," one farmer told me during a routine inspection of his property. "We just want to harvest our moisture and sell it in town without being robbed by raiders or taxed into poverty by bureaucrats. The Empire keeps the trade routes open and maintains basic law and order. That's worth something, but it doesn't mean we love you." His honesty was refreshing after months of dealing with the carefully neutral responses that most Imperial citizens offered when questioned about their loyalty. But it also highlighted the fundamental challenge facing the Empire's efforts to maintain control over thousands of diverse worlds, with populations that had their own histories, cultures, and priorities that often conflicted with Imperial policies. The Jawas represented another aspect of this challenge. These scavenger creatures had their own social structures and economic systems that predated Imperial rule by thousands of years. They were willing to trade with Imperial forces when it served their interests, but they maintained their traditional way of life regardless of what laws or regulations the Empire attempted to impose. Trying to force them into compliance with Imperial standards would have required resources far out of proportion to any benefit such compliance might provide. During my time on Tatooine, I began to understand how the Empire's standardized approach to governance created problems when applied to worlds that didn't fit the standard template. The same policies that worked well on urbanized industrial worlds like Coruscant or Quad created unnecessary friction when imposed on primitive agricultural societies or nomadic desert cultures. But the Imperial bureaucracy was not designed to accommodate such variations, and local commanders rarely had the authority to modify policies to suit local conditions. The Tusken Raiders provided the most extreme example of this disconnect. These indigenous people had lived in the deep desert for millennia, developing a culture perfectly adapted to their harsh environment. From their perspective, the moisture farmers and other off-world settlers were invaders who had stolen their traditional hunting grounds and disrupted the ecological balance that sustained their way of life. The raiders' attacks on isolated settlements were not random acts of violence, but responses to what they saw as an ongoing invasion of their territory. Imperial policy toward the Tusken Raiders was simple. They were classified as hostile aliens whose attacks on Imperial citizens would be met with appropriate force. No attempt was made to understand their motivations or find diplomatic solutions to the conflicts that arose between them and the settler population. This approach was consistent with Imperial doctrine, but it also guaranteed that the violence would continue indefinitely, requiring constant military resources to suppress an enemy that could never be completely defeated because it was fighting to defend its homeland. I learned to listen carefully to these conversations without appearing to pay attention, picking up fragments of information about rebel movements, criminal activities, and the general mood of the population across multiple star systems. Much of what I heard contradicted the official reports that flowed through Imperial communication channels, suggesting that the situation in many areas was more unstable than our commanders were willing to acknowledge. The rebels were portrayed in Imperial briefings as a small but dangerous terrorist organization, with limited popular support and no real hope of challenging Imperial authority. But the Cantina conversations told a different story, describing rebel cells that operated openly in some sectors and enjoyed significant local support from populations that had grown tired of Imperial taxation and regulation. The contradiction was troubling, suggesting that either our intelligence was seriously flawed or our leadership was deliberately concealing the true scope of the threat we faced. This concern deepened during my third assignment, a transfer to the garrison on Scarif, where Imperial forces protected a critical research facility that was working on classified projects for the Imperial military. The tropical world was beautiful but heavily fortified, with multiple layers of security designed to prevent unauthorized access to the research data stored in the facility's central vault. Our duties involved perimeter patrols and checkpoint operations that ensured only personnel with appropriate clearances could enter the restricted areas. The Scarif facility was unlike anything I had experienced during my previous assignments. The level of security was extraordinary, with automated defenses, overlapping sensor networks, and multiple redundant systems designed to prevent any possibility of infiltration or sabotage. The research staff worked under conditions of extreme compartmentalization, with each individual knowing only what was necessary for their specific assignments, and no one except the highest-ranking administrators having access to complete information about the project's ultimate purpose. The Stormtrooper garrison was larger than seemed necessary for protecting a research facility, and our training emphasized rapid response to major security breaches rather than the routine patrol duties that characterized most planetary assignments. We practiced repelling large-scale assault operations, coordinating with orbital defenses, and evacuating critical personnel and data in case the facility came under attack. The implication was clear. Someone expected Scarif to become a target for rebel operations, and they wanted us prepared for a significant battle. The first indication that these preparations were justified came during a routine patrol near the facility's communications array. My squad detected unusual electromagnetic emissions that suggested unauthorized monitoring equipment in the area, and a search revealed sophisticated surveillance devices that had been carefully concealed among the natural vegetation. The equipment was too advanced to be the work of smugglers or common criminals, indicating that professional intelligence operatives had been conducting reconnaissance of the facility. "This is rebel hardware," confirmed the technician who examined the captured devices. "Military-grade equipment designed for long-term surveillance operations." Someone has been watching this place for months, collecting detailed information about our security procedures and personnel movements. The discovery triggered a facility-wide security alert and a comprehensive review of all access logs and personnel files. Additional Stormtrooper units were deployed from other worlds to reinforce our garrison, and the research staff was subjected to enhanced screening procedures designed to identify potential security risks. Despite these precautions, there were signs that the surveillance operation had been more extensive than the captured equipment suggested. Several research personnel reported noticing small discrepancies in their work areas that indicated someone had been examining their materials when they were not present. Computer logs showed access attempts to classified databases that occurred during times when the authorized users were documented to be elsewhere. Most disturbing of all, some of the facility's security cameras had recorded brief images of figures moving through restricted areas during periods when no legitimate personnel should have been present. The atmosphere at the facility became increasingly tense as the security investigations continued without identifying the source of the infiltration. Research staff became suspicious of their colleagues. Stormtroopers viewed every civilian with heightened vigilance, and the facility's administrators imposed ever more restrictive protocols that made normal operations increasingly difficult. The psychological pressure was taking its toll on everyone involved, but the nature of the project made it impossible to reduce security measures or transfer operations to a less compromised location. During this period, I was assigned to the Data Vault security detail, a position that required the highest level of clearance and carried significant responsibility for protecting the facility's most sensitive information. The vault itself was an engineering marvel, protected by multiple force fields, automated defense systems, and biometric locks that required authorization from multiple senior personnel to open. Inside, banks of data storage devices contained information that was classified at levels I had never encountered during my previous service. Working in the vault gave me glimpses of the true scope of the project that Scarif was designed to protect. The research focused on some kind of superweapon that would provide the Empire with unprecedented military capability. A device so powerful that its mere existence would end the rebellion by demonstrating the futility of resistance to Imperial authority. The technical specifications were beyond my understanding, but the strategic implications were clear. The Empire was developing something that would change the nature of galactic warfare forever. The knowledge was both exciting and troubling. On one hand, such a weapon would finally provide the Empire with the means to end the civil war that had been tearing the galaxy apart for years. No rebel world would be able to resist Imperial authority when faced with the threat of complete annihilation. And the peace that followed would allow billions of people to live their lives without fear of violence or instability. On the other hand, the moral implications of a weapon capable of such destruction were staggering, even for someone who had been conditioned to accept the necessity of extreme measures in service to the greater good. My personal involvement in protecting the development of such a device forced me to confront questions about the nature of the Empire I served and the prices it was willing to pay to achieve its goals. The Stormtrooper training that had shaped my thinking for years emphasized obedience to authority and trust in the wisdom of Imperial leadership. But that training had not prepared me for situations where the orders I received might conflict with my own understanding of right and wrong. These philosophical concerns became secondary when the rebel assault on Scarif finally materialized. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, with rebel ships penetrating the planetary defense grid while ground forces attempted to infiltrate the research facility itself. The battle was unlike anything I had experienced during my years of Imperial service, characterized by desperate intensity that spoke of operations planned as suicide missions with objectives that justified any cost in lives or resources. The rebel ground forces were small but highly skilled, consisting of elite commandos who had studied the facility's defenses and developed specific tactics for penetrating our security measures. They moved with precision and coordination that spoke of extensive training and detailed intelligence about our defensive arrangements. But what struck me most about these enemy soldiers was their obvious determination and the complete absence of the fanaticism that Imperial propaganda attributed to rebel fighters. These were professional soldiers conducting a military operation in service to a cause they believed in completely. They showed no unnecessary cruelty toward captured Imperial personnel, took risks to avoid civilian casualties, and conducted themselves according to military protocols that would have been recognizable to any Imperial officer. The realization that we were facing opponents who shared our own professional standards and moral codes made the battle more disturbing than if they had been the mindless terrorists described in our briefings. The fighting raged across the facility for hours, with both sides taking heavy casualties as the rebels pressed their assault against increasingly desperate Imperial defenses. My unit was assigned to defend the data vault, a mission that would determine whether the rebels could access the information they had come to steal. The engagement was close-quarters combat in corridors and chambers designed for research rather than warfare, with every doorway and intersection becoming a potential battleground. I watched fellow Stormtroopers fall to rebel weapons fired with deadly accuracy by opponents who seemed to know our tactics better than we did ourselves. The rebels fought with equipment that matched our own in quality and effectiveness, suggesting that they had access to military resources far beyond what Imperial intelligence had estimated. Most unsettling of all, some of their weapons and equipment bore Imperial markings, indicating that they had supporters within the Imperial military itself. The final assault on the data vault was led by a small team of rebels who had somehow penetrated the facility's deepest security layers despite the presence of hundreds of Imperial defenders. They moved through the corridors with confidence that suggested detailed knowledge of the facility's layout, avoiding security checkpoints and automated defenses with precision that spoke of inside information. When they finally reached the vault entrance, they had the access codes necessary to override the biometric locks and force field generators. The moment that crystallized my understanding of the conflict came when I found myself face to face with one of these rebel infiltrators in the vault's central chamber. She was a young woman who moved with the confidence of a trained soldier, but showed none of the hatred or fanaticism that I had been taught to expect from enemies of the Empire. When she raised her weapon to cover her team's escape with the stolen data, she looked directly into my helmet's visual sensors and spoke words that would change my perspective forever. "You don't have to die for this," she said, her voice carrying no trace of threat or mockery. "You're protecting something that will kill billions of innocent people. You can choose to step aside and let us prevent that from happening. This doesn't have to end with more death." I could have killed her easily. My training, my conditioning, and my loyalty to the Empire all demanded that I eliminate this enemy of the state and continue with my mission. But something in her words resonated with doubts that had been growing in my mind for months. Questions about the price of the peace the Empire promised and whether that price was worth paying. Instead of firing, I found myself lowering my weapon and looking at this young woman not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as another human being who had made her own choice about how to serve what she believed was right. The moment stretched between us, filled with possibilities that neither of our respective causes had prepared us to consider. Her team escaped with the data they had come to steal, and I made no effort to pursue them or raise an alarm that might have led to their capture. The destruction of the Death Star at the Battle of Yavin followed shortly after the rebel theft of the technical specifications from Scarif. The news reached our garrison through official channels, described as a terrorist attack that had destroyed a peaceful research station and killed thousands of innocent personnel. But those of us who had been present during the data theft understood the true sequence of events and the role our failure had played in the Empire's defeat. The psychological impact of this realization was devastating. We had been told that we were protecting a defensive installation designed to maintain peace and stability throughout the galaxy. The discovery that we had actually been guarding the plans for a weapon capable of destroying entire worlds forced us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of the empire we served and the methods it was willing to employ to achieve its goals. Some of my fellow Stormtroopers responded to this knowledge with increased dedication to Imperial service, arguing that the rebels' theft of the Death Star plans only proved their terrorist nature and the necessity of extreme measures to defeat them. Others became withdrawn and began questioning orders that had previously been followed without hesitation. A few requested transfers to other units or assignments that would distance them from the classified projects that had defined our service on Scarif. My own response was more complex. The knowledge that I had played a role in protecting the development of the Death Star created a sense of personal responsibility for the destruction it had caused before its destruction at Yavin. The planet of Alderaan had been obliterated to demonstrate the weapon's capabilities, killing billions of people who had committed no crime beyond living on a world that supported the rebellion. The weight of that knowledge was difficult to bear, even for someone who had been trained to accept the necessity of extreme measures in service to Imperial security. But the rebels' destruction of the Death Star also demonstrated that the Empire was not invincible, that properly motivated opponents could achieve victories against overwhelming odds when they were fighting for principles they believed in completely. The implications of this realization extended far beyond the immediate military situation, suggesting that the Empire's control over the galaxy was less secure than its propaganda claimed, and that alternatives to Imperial rule might be possible. The collapse of Imperial authority following the Battle of Endor was not immediate or complete, but it was undeniable. Communication networks failed, supply lines were disrupted, and local commanders found themselves making decisions about how to respond to rapidly changing circumstances without clear guidance from higher authority. Some Imperial forces continued fighting, determined to preserve what they could of the order they had served. Others surrendered to rebel forces or simply abandoned their posts and tried to return to civilian life. I remained with my unit for several more months as we conducted a fighting withdrawal from our positions and attempted to reach an Imperial stronghold where we could regroup and receive new orders. The period was characterized by constant uncertainty, as we received conflicting reports about the status of Imperial forces throughout the galaxy and the progress of rebel advances. Many of the worlds that had been loyal to the Empire began declaring their independence or joining the emerging New Republic, further fragmenting Imperial authority and making coordinated resistance increasingly difficult. The journey was harrowing, conducted through territory that was increasingly hostile as news of the Emperor's death spread, and local populations began to rise against Imperial occupation forces. Many of my fellow Stormtroopers were killed or captured during this period, and those who survived were forced to confront the reality that the Empire they had served was no longer the dominant force in the galaxy. The white armor that had once been a symbol of invincible authority became a liability that marked us as representatives of a defeated regime. The Imperial remnant that we eventually reached was a shadow of the mighty war machine that had once ruled thousands of worlds. The officers were demoralized, the equipment was worn out from constant use without adequate maintenance, and the troops were increasingly questioning whether their continued service served any meaningful purpose. Morale collapsed further when we learned that several high-ranking Imperial officials had already negotiated separate peace agreements with the new Republic, accepting amnesty in exchange for their cooperation in the transition to a new galactic government. My own decision to leave Imperial service came not from a single dramatic moment, but from the gradual accumulation of experiences that had undermined my faith in the cause I had served for so many years. The Empire had promised order and stability, but the methods it used to achieve those goals had created the very instability it claimed to prevent. The rebels had been portrayed as terrorists and criminals, but many of them were ordinary people who had been driven to resistance by Imperial policies that prioritized control over justice. The white armor that had once been a symbol of pride and authority became a burden that marked me as a representative of a failed system. The training that had shaped my thinking for years had not prepared me for the moral complexity of the choices I faced. The brotherhood that had sustained me through years of military service was fragmenting as individual stormtroopers made their own decisions about whether to continue fighting for a cause that no longer seemed viable. I removed my helmet for the final time on a transport bound for one of the refugee worlds that had agreed to accept former Imperial personnel who wanted to start new lives. The face that looked back at me from the reflection in the viewport was older and more weathered than I remembered, marked by years of service that had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I was no longer TK-421, anonymous component of the Imperial war machine. I was simply a man trying to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. The years that followed were difficult but ultimately rewarding. I found work as a security coordinator for a shipping company, using the skills I had learned as a stormtrooper to protect cargo and personnel without the moral complications that had plagued my Imperial service. The work was honest and straightforward, with clear objectives and measurable results that didn't require me to question whether my actions served a greater good. I married a woman named Elena who had lost her husband during the fighting on Alderaan, and we built a quiet life together on a farming world where people were more interested in the weather and crop yields than galactic politics. She understood the weight I carried from my years of Imperial service without requiring me to explain details that I preferred not to discuss. Our relationship was built on mutual respect and shared understanding of the costs that war imposed on those who fought it and those who survived its aftermath. We had 2 children, a son and a daughter, who grew up in a galaxy where the new Republic was working to establish institutions based on principles of democracy and individual freedom rather than authoritarian control. Watching them develop their own values and make their own choices about how to contribute to their communities gave me hope that the sacrifices made by both sides during the Civil War had ultimately served a constructive purpose. But I never forgot the lessons I had learned during my time in Imperial service, and I tried to pass those lessons on to the young people I encountered who were facing their own choices about how to serve the greater good. The galaxy needed order and stability, but it also needed justice and compassion. The challenge was finding ways to achieve both without sacrificing one for the other, balancing the legitimate need for security against the equally legitimate desire for freedom and self-determination. The Stormtrooper armor that had defined my identity for so many years sits in a storage locker, preserved as a reminder of the choices I made and the prices I paid for them. Sometimes I take it out and examine the scratches and scorch marks that tell the story of battles fought in service to a cause I no longer believe in completely. The armor is empty now, but it once contained a human being who was trying to do what he thought was right in a galaxy where right and wrong were not always clearly defined. That, perhaps, is the most important lesson of my years as a stormtrooper. We were not monsters or mindless automatons, despite what rebel propaganda claimed. We were people, flawed and confused and trying to make sense of our place in a universe that seemed determined to test our values and challenge our assumptions. Some of us chose well and some of us chose poorly, but all of us were making choices based on the information we had and the principles we believed in at the time. The Empire fell not because its soldiers lacked courage or dedication, but because the system it represented could not adapt to the changing needs and expectations of the populations it governed. The authoritarian approach that had seemed necessary during the chaos following the Clone Wars became increasingly problematic as the galaxy stabilized and people began to demand greater participation in the decisions that affected their lives. The new republic that replaced the Empire faces many of the same challenges, struggling to balance order with freedom, security with justice, unity with diversity. Whether the new republic will succeed where the Empire failed remains to be seen. But the lessons of the past provide guidance for those who are willing to learn from them. The desire for security and stability is legitimate and must be addressed by any government that hopes to maintain popular support. But that security cannot come at the cost of the very freedoms and rights that make life worth living. The challenge is finding the proper balance, creating institutions that can provide safety and order without becoming oppressive or corrupt. I am often asked whether I regret my service as a Stormtrooper, whether I feel guilt about the actions I took in the name of Imperial authority. The answer is complicated, like most truths worth telling. I regret the suffering that Imperial policies caused to innocent people, and I regret my role in perpetuating a system that valued order above all other considerations. But I do not regret the brotherhood I shared with my fellow soldiers, the skills I learned that have served me well in civilian life, or the hard-won understanding of the complexities of galactic governance that my service provided. The men and women who served as Stormtroopers were products of their time and circumstances, shaped by training and conditioning designed to create effective soldiers rather than independent thinkers. We were taught to follow orders without question, to trust in the wisdom of our superiors, and to subordinate our individual concerns to the greater good of Imperial stability. These lessons served the Empire's purposes, but they also limited our ability to question policies that might have been wrong or to adapt to changing circumstances that required different approaches. The galaxy is a vast and dangerous place, filled with competing interests and conflicting values that make simple solutions impossible. The Empire's approach to these challenges was fatally flawed, but the problems it tried to solve were real and continue to plague the New Republic today. Pirates and warlords still threaten trade routes, criminal organizations still exploit vulnerable populations, and the absence of strong central authority still creates opportunities for chaos and suffering in regions that lack effective local governance. The challenge for any galactic government is finding ways to address these problems without recreating the authoritarian excesses that characterized Imperial rule. This requires institutions that are strong enough to maintain order but flexible enough to adapt to local conditions and responsive enough to address legitimate grievances before they turn into armed rebellion. It also requires leaders who understand that the use of force must be limited to situations where it is truly necessary, and that long-term stability depends on earning the consent of the governed rather than simply imposing obedience through fear. My experience as a Stormtrooper taught me that good intentions are not enough to justify questionable methods, and that the road to tyranny is often paved with sincere desires to protect people from themselves and their enemies. The Empire began as a response to legitimate concerns about galactic instability and the need for strong leadership during a time of crisis. But over time, it became corrupted by its own power and lost sight of the principles it was supposed to serve. The individuals who served the Empire, whether as Stormtroopers or officers or bureaucrats, were generally sincere in their belief that they were working for the greater good. But sincerity is not the same as wisdom, and good intentions do not excuse harmful actions. The challenge for any society is creating institutions that can harness the good intentions of its citizens while preventing them from being used to justify oppression or abuse. This is what it was like to be an Imperial Stormtrooper. To serve something larger than yourself while struggling to maintain your humanity. To enforce order while questioning whether that order was just. To follow orders while taking responsibility for the consequences of your actions. It was a life of contradictions and moral complexity that the simple narratives of propaganda and popular entertainment cannot capture adequately. The white armor may be empty now, but the lessons learned by those who wore it continue to resonate through a galaxy still struggling to find the balance between freedom and security, between individual rights and collective responsibility. Those lessons, painful as they may be, are part of the price we pay for wisdom and the foundation upon which better choices can be built for future generations. In the end, we were all trying to serve the light as we understood it, even when we could not see it clearly through the darkness that surrounded us. That effort, flawed and tragic as it sometimes was, deserves to be remembered and understood rather than simply condemned or forgotten. For in understanding what we were and why we made the choices we did, perhaps the galaxy can better choose what it wants to become and avoid repeating the mistakes that led to so much unnecessary suffering. The legacy of the Stormtroopers is not just one of blind obedience or military efficiency, but of ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, trying to do their duty as they understood it while struggling with the moral implications of their actions. That struggle continues today in different forms, as each generation faces its own choices about how to balance competing values and serve the common good. The armor may be different, but the fundamental questions remain the same. How do we protect what we value without destroying what makes life worth living? How do we maintain order without crushing the spirit that makes us human? How do we serve something greater than ourselves while remaining true to our own conscience and values? These are the questions that every generation must answer for itself, learning from the mistakes of the past while forging new paths toward a better future. The Stormtroopers of the Empire were not the first to struggle with these challenges, and they will not be the last. But their story serves as a reminder that the choices we make in service to causes larger than ourselves have consequences that extend far beyond our own lives, shaping the galaxy that future generations will inherit.